with the Jazz Zone, and we're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Professor of African American History at the University of Houston. He has published about 50 books, and we're looking forward to a new book which you can pre-order called The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. And we wanted to talk about, let Melinda kick everything off. Melinda, you can take over.
Yeah, let's go to the refugees in South Africa, and just reminding that they are white South Africans.
I just received a phone call this morning from a friend in Washington, D.C. He was in DuPont Circle, the heart of the city, and he looked up Connecticut Avenue, and approaching him was a cavalcade, a motorcade of men on motorcycles escorting buses containing these so-called refugees from South Africa. That is to say, South Africans of European descent who are part of the community that continues to control the commanding heights of that economy. And yet, according to Elon Musk, also born in apartheid South Africa, first buddy, reputedly the richest man on planet Earth, these so-called refugees are part of a community that has been persecuted and denigrated, which of course the Pretoria government adamantly objects to. I think that of all of the misdeeds perpetrated over the past few months by the Trump regime, including the deportation of undocumented workers to hellhole prisons in El Salvador and upcoming deporting them to Rwanda and Libya, despite the attacks on the universities, on law firms, on the media, despite an ill-considered trade war that has led to the layoffs of thousands of workers, 20,000 at UPS, to cite one example amongst many, and has turned once thriving port towns into ghost towns. Despite all of that and more, perhaps there's no more episode that's emblematic of U.S. imperialism in crisis, not to mention the historical trajectory of U.S. settler colonialism, than what my friend witnessed this morning in Washington, D.C. First of all, as already referenced, Mr. Trump has had what he considers to be an adamant anti-immigrant ethos. Obviously, an exception is being carved out with regard to these so-called Afrikaners, who are now not only disgracing the land of this disgraced country, but will be subsidized by our taxpayer dollars. Not only that subsidy that I've just made reference to in terms of this motorcade, but also in terms of housing and setting them up at the same time that Haitians who are in this country under so-called temporary protective status are in the process of being deported by the thousands as we speak. And it's consistent and congruent with the trajectory of the United States of America, because despite the fact that you had this poet, Emmett Lazarus, at the end of the 19th century, who wrote these words about the United States: "Give me your tired, your poor, your yearning masses, your masses yearning to breathe free," which was replicated on the so-called Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, close by Manhattan and Staten Island. Even then, she was only referencing objectively those of European descent, because at the same time she was writing those words, you had Chinese migrants who were being bashed in San Francisco, and in fact on the entire Pacific coast from Seattle to San Diego. And the fact that this elementary point is hardly recognized by many of our friends on the left, including the Canadian left, I'm afraid to say, who are in the process of having their sovereignty challenged, but yet are clinging desperately to the old-time religion that the creation of the United States was a great leap forward for humanity, that somehow it carried the seeds for abolition, which is malicious and false. And they continue to cling to this notion even as their sovereignty is being challenged. So I think that one of the most significant con games in the history of the world has been perpetrated by those who founded by the United States, and it's somehow appropriate that U.S. imperialism in its declining stage is being led by a con man par excellence, speaking of one Donald J. Trump. And I should also say that what you witnessed this morning in Washington, D.C., and what others will be witnessing in days and weeks to come in the United States of America is one more reason why we need to take a fresh look at politics in Southern Africa. There's a lot of disappointment with regard to the government now ruling in Pretoria, but now we see that there's been enormous pressure on that government, which you need to take into account when you ascertain where they may have come up short. You need only look across the border in Zimbabwe, where, like South Africa, actually more so than South Africa, they executed land reform and have been under a regime of punishing sanctions ever since. What triggered this exodus from South Africa that has now descended on the shores of the United States is this claim that the attempt to pass laws to allow for land reform in South Africa supposedly is racist, supposedly contravenes international law, even though in the United States of America, there is a legal process known as the power of eminent domain, which allows the government, any government, that is to say on the federal or state level, to claim the land of any property holder if the government wants to build a highway or a freeway, for example. So what's going on right now in this country is ludicrous. It's a travesty. It unveils and unmasks the true nature of U.S. settler colonialism and U.S. imperialism. But perhaps the largest tragedy of all is that some of our friends on the left have yet to grasp this elementary fact.
Yeah, Dr. Horne, could I ask you, how do you see the current government of Zimbabwe as we speak?
Well, as noted, the government's under tremendous pressure. I'm going to be giving a number of talks on Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the Sahel nations, which are also under tremendous pressure, which I think has led them to cut this deal with Morocco to gain access to Atlantic ports, which may not be in the best interests of the struggling masses of Western Sahara now claimed by Morocco. I think I spoke about that on Diasporic Music last week, and I'll be speaking about it on a number of programs in the coming days and weeks. And likewise, Zimbabwe is under tremendous pressure, and yet the government has been able to keep its head above water, particularly if you look at what is now on our agenda today, which is Victory Day in Moscow, Day 9th, 2025. President Emerson Mnangagwa was present along with a coterie of other leaders, including Diaz-Canel of Cuba and Lula of Brazil and Xi of China and Maduro of Venezuela. And to a greater or lesser degree, all of these regimes are under tremendous pressure. And I think that as a result, they merit our solidarity, because their dislodging will not necessarily be a step forward for anti-imperialism. In fact, it'll be a step forward for imperialism. So I think that Zimbabwe, at the end of the day, it took arrows in its chest under the previous administration of Robert Mugabe when they decided to try to reverse the fruits of settler colonialism by reclaiming land illicitly taken by European invaders, some of whom only arrived as recently as 1945. It's not as if it were like South Africa, where the invading began in 1652. the invading of Zimbabwe actually was initiated in the 1890s and then accelerated in 1945. And so Zimbabwe is under the lash. It's been suffering, but certainly I think it merits our solidarity.
I know you were not surprised that Nigeria was not there. I guess they weren't there, but was Senegal there? The head of state of Senegal, did he make the trip to Moscow?
Not to my knowledge, and up to this point, and I'll be talking about this more when I talk about West Africa on various programs in the next week or so. Senegal, the regime of President Faye, which campaigned vigorously against the previous leader Macky Sall and swept into office on many promises and pledges, including dislodging the French-based currency, which dominates the economy of Senegal and many former French colonies. It is yet to move aggressively on that score. I thought it would be more in solidarity with the Sahel nations. I think that it's lagging to a degree on that front as well. So let's keep our options open and our eyes open with regard to Senegal. But no, to my knowledge, the leadership was not present, at least at the presidential and prime ministerial level, in Moscow on May 9th, 2025.
Did you have any further information, or did you want to go further on May Day in Moscow, or you want to move on to something else?
Well, just with regard to the purpose of Victory Day, it marks the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism. And needless to say, that victory had tremendous repercussions for its close cousins. Speaking of colonialism in Africa and the Caribbean and Asia and Latin America, speaking of Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid in the United States of America, it's no accident that those systems of iniquity and inequality began to retreat in a helter-skelter fashion post-1945, since their big brother in Berlin had been overthrown. It's important to point out that the Soviet Union was the major target of German fascism, as reflected in the fact that 24+ million Soviet nationals lost their lives during that titanic conflict. The United States and its allies are trying to rewrite the history of that conflict, stressing more D-Day, June 6, 1944, when the U.S. and its allies landed in Western Europe and began marching towards Berlin. They had delayed D-Day inordinately because they were not necessarily opposed to Berlin bleeding Moscow dry, which is what it was doing up until May 1945. And we should also point out that this attempt to overthrow Soviet power was just the latest attempt to overthrow the regime in Russia, be it pre-1917 or post-1917. That is to say that it's no accident that in 1904, British banking interests, and indeed London itself, had supported the Japanese attack on Russia, 1904, which had not only come within an eyelash of weakening forevermore the Tsar, but also it marked a new stage in terms of the struggle against white supremacy, because as leaders as diverse as Du Bois, Nehru, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam indicated, the fact that this Asian power was able to go successfully toe-to-toe against this European power, speaking of Russia, was seen as highly significant. And certainly 1904 set the stage for 1917 and the Russian Revolution. And of course, setting the stage for 1904 was the Crimea War of the 1850s, when Britain and France and the sick man of Europe, speaking of Ottoman Turkey, they too ganged up on Russia. I should point out as well that that particular conflict had reverberations in Western Canada, where I'm now sitting, because there were conflicts between Russians cited in Alaska, which was then their colonial possession, and the British in Victoria, British Columbia, not to mention the Yankees across the border in their territory that they claimed in what is now the state of Washington and the state of Oregon. So it's important to reflect upon the profundity and the meaning of May 1945. It was quickly followed by the Red Scare and the Cold War, which then eventuated ultimately in the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991.
And how do you see the Carney-Trump talks? He came back, he didn't put Carney down like he talked about Justin Trudeau. I don't know what that was all about in terms of, he seemed to have a big problem with Justin Trudeau, because I guess Justin Trudeau talked back, but Carney doesn't seem to be biting his tongue on a lot of things either.
Well, it was really quite insulting to Canada that the leader of this country is in the White House and being insulted in the sense that Mr. Trump does not retreat on his ludicrous claim that Canada should become the 51st state, that Canadians would be better off if they too were subjected to medical bankruptcies and mass shootings like the beleaguered masses of the United States of America. As I've said before, I understand why there's been so much hope that has been placed upon the trajectory of Mark Carney, the current prime minister, despite the fact that he is part of the 1%, despite the fact that he was formerly head of not only the Bank of Canada, but the Bank of England, and despite the fact that he has given no indication that he's about to abandon the ruinous foreign policy of Ottawa, which has managed to execute in one fell swoop negative relations with China, Russia, India, and the United States simultaneously. I think that this idea that somehow Canada can be bailed out by the European Union is fantasy talk. I think that you only need consult the the travails of the current regime in Ukraine, which also has been seduced by the happy talk coming from Berlin, London, and Paris. In fact, the leaders of those nations, accompanied by the leader in Warsaw, Poland, were just in Kiev, suggesting that Russia should bow to having an immediate ceasefire for 30 days. So they don't say this, so this is what it amounts to, so that they could rearm Ukraine. They did that trick before. I don't know why they think it's going to work twice, but Mr. Putin countered by saying that there should be unconditional peace talks in Istanbul. So we shall see. But certainly, Mr. Carney has a very difficult path ahead. You already see a weakening of the auto industry in Canada. Mr. Trump was quite insulting in the Oval Office when he once again said that the United States does not need Canadian cars, does not need Canadian steel. I think all he's serving to do is unleash a backlash against the U.S. tourism industry, because Canadians are a major source of revenue for the U.S. tourism industry, and Canadians are tending to boycott trips to the United States of America, including hockey fans who ordinarily would be found in Florida, for example, to see their local team play the Florida Panthers, for example. So, once again, I understand why there's hope placed in the trajectory of Mr. Carney and the Liberal Party, but I would urge and encourage Canadians to question and query the federal regime in Ottawa about their foreign policy, because it's on a reckless and dangerous course.
Speaking of hockey, I don't want to get off track, but Ovechkin, I think, was hurt last night. Ovechkin being the pro-Putin hockey player from the Washington Capitals. But Linda, you have the next question?
Yeah, let's go into the China trade talk.
Well, what's happening is that in Geneva, Switzerland, on Saturday and today, Sunday, there have been high-level talks between U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the Trade Representative Jameson Greer, and their Chinese counterparts. Mr. Trump has suggested that he's willing to drop tariffs against Chinese exports to the United States from 145% to 80%, which is really rather ridiculous because that still means a de facto embargo against Chinese goods coming to the United States of America. Now, in all fairness, I should mention that China has said that it would not engage in talks with the United States on trade unless and until Mr. Trump rolled back that 145%, which he has not done. I think that bespeaks the fact that China might be suffering some discomfort from this trade war as well, despite the fact that since the first Trump trade war of 2017-2018, they have successfully sought to reorient trade from the United States to Africa, to Asia in particular, particularly ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, led by Indonesia, but including Vietnam and Malaysia in particular, not to mention Brazil, which in the agricultural sphere is replacing U.S. soybeans, just as Argentina is replacing U.S. beef to the Chinese market. So what we need to understand about these talks in Geneva is that they're equivalent in some ways of the nuclear talks that used to be held between the Soviets and the United States during the height of the Cold War. Perhaps it could be considered good news that the conflict has migrated with regard to socialism versus capitalism from the sphere of nuclear arms and reducing same to the sphere of trade talks and the discussion of which commodities and which exports will be tariffed and which will not. Perhaps we can see that as a sign of hope.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. And Dr. Horne, we are getting ready to experience the AU and the CARICOM summit, I guess, in Ethiopia. And you're an authority on the black press. And, how does this period in history differ from when you were, I think the brother's name was Abbott, when he was, running, it was one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, black publishers. He had sent people to, many parts of the world. How is the press, the black press in America, 2025, do you think that they're going to cover it any differently than he did? And when I say differently, are they going to really, spend some time on it, or they can't ignore it? But how do you think they're going to cover it?
Well, first of all, a footnote. I just received a text from a listener who says that she can hear typing in the background. I don't hear it. I don't know if anybody's typing, but it was suggested that there would be a cessation, at least for the next 7 minutes or so. In any case, with regard to the black press, I think there's been a certain regression. I think that during the era of Robert Abbott of the Chicago Defender, of Claude Barnett of the Associated Negro Press, I wrote a book about his enterprise. He was also based in Chicago. At that particular moment, the black people languishing under the lash of Jim Crow were third-class citizens. They knew that they needed international support, which helps to explain why the Associated Negro Press had correspondents all over the world and covered global events much more assiduously than their counterparts today. I am trying to encourage the black press in the United States to send reporters to the African Union CARICOM Summit, September 7th, 2025, in Addis Ababa, as noted, Ethiopia, to press the question of reparations, which of course is high on the agenda for AU and CARICOM, but also to press the question of sanctions against the Trump regime because of the depredations inflicted upon people of African descent in its jurisdiction. Not to mention, once again, this insult of using our tax dollars to import these so-called Afrikaners from post-apartheid South Africa and putting them up in luxury settings and feeding them and clothing them as if they need that kind of material assistance. It's outrageous, it's ludicrous, and it's the sort of issue that's made to order for this AU CARICOM Summit September 2025. And I'm happy to say that I have received word that there will be a delegation from the San Francisco Bay Area, which once again is in the vanguard. Recall that this was the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. And once again, they're flexing their muscles and showing their vanguard status by organizing a major delegation from Northern California. I would only hope that our friends, not only in Los Angeles, but Chicago, New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Washington, Toronto, and yes, Nova Scotia and British Columbia would emulate our comrades and friends in Berkeley and Oakland.
While you're listening to Diasporic music, do you remember, well, I know you remember, but Donald Warden, who became a Muslim and became an international lawyer. I think he supported a lot of the Arab states, and he was the Afro-American Association. I think Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Ron Karenga, Mamadou Lumumba, people like that, all came out of his organization. Did you ever come in contact with Donald Warden? I forgot what his Muslim name was, but he was a great international lawyer.
I do not recall encountering him during my stay in the San Francisco Bay Area, but who knows? I might have crossed paths with him without knowing it.
Okay, is there anything else, Melinda?
I don't know where we want to go from here. Do we have a little bit more about the effects of layoffs in the U.S. on the other side of the trade war?
The United States is about to go through some very stormy economic weather. In fact, it's already going through stormy economic weather. The dislodging of goods at the L.A. Long Beach port has plummeted. The same can be said about Seattle Tacoma, that port. The same can be said about Savannah, etc. I've already referenced the layoffs at UPS, a union-organized firm that engages in delivery of packages, unionized by the Teamsters, whose leader attended the Republican convention in the summer of 2024. You should expect similar layoffs to hit FedEx. You should expect similar layoffs to hit the docks on the East Coast and allied trucking firms as well. Mr. Trump has embarked on this trade war without thinking through the ultimate consequences. But ultimately, I think what happened is a number of factors. One, I think that the fact that the right wing can continue to prevail in the United States of America gives them false confidence that they can prevail as easily on the international level, which is obviously not the case. In other words, they don't have an acute and firm grasp of the global correlation of forces. They refuse to recognize and acknowledge that this is not 1945. The United States is not standing like a colossus bestriding the globe. And in fact, there is an alternative power that's rising in the East, or I would say in the West, speaking of the People's Republic of China, allied by his comrades in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a counterpoint and a challenger to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the fact that we are also in the foothills of fascism in the United States of America, as represented by the continued epidemic of police killings, not least of Black Americans, the threat to send U.S. nationals to hellhole-like prisons in El Salvador, the fact that undocumented workers are already being sent to El Salvador from the United States and are slated to be sent to Libya and Rwanda as we speak. I think that that kind of hysterical reaction, as evidenced by the Trump administration, is a reflection of the fact that they really have no answers with regard to the rise of China, and that therefore they're lashing out angrily and hysterically. Unfortunately, many of the working class and the poor, in particular the population of African descent, will be the ultimate victims of this present crisis.
And Dr. Horne, is there anything else you would like to, you only have 3 minutes left, anything else you would like to deal with?
Well, once again, I would mention the book that'll be out in a few days, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. And I would particularly urge and encourage our friends in Canada to take a look at that book, because as noted, I think they really need a new vision of the history of the United States of America. On the one hand, they're very critical, understandably and justifiably, about the Trump regime and his threats to annex Canada. But their view of U.S. history, which salutes the racist republicanism that arose after 1776, is due for severe adjustment. I know that they don't like monarchy. I understand that. But what they need to realize is that the republicanism that arose in the United States of America migrated from the divine right of monarchs to initially the divine right of European men of property, and ultimately that class line was erased to a certain degree 200 or so odd years ago with the rise of the regime of Andrew Jackson, Mr. Trump's favorite president, who, of course, accelerated the dislodging of First Nations, indigenous people from their land, and made sure that men of European descent were able to claim that land. And that particular kind of psychosis is still a governing principle. And to end where we began, that helps to shed light on why my friend called me this morning really upset about the spectacle of Afrikaners from South Africa being feted by our tax dollars, subsidized by our tax dollars under spurious and ludicrous claims that they were facing persecution in the United States of America. You can draw a straight line from July 4th, 1776 to May 11th, 2025.
And with that, I would like to thank you, and we will see you in the whirlwind next week, and take care of yourself, sir.
Good luck. Bye-bye.
I would like to thank Lisa Watson, all the guests that have appeared on the show today. Happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers and all over the world. And Melinda Francis, any parting words?
Yeah, like all listeners, to stay safe, and we will definitely see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.